In 2010, during an interview with me, the Dalai Lama had said that when he turned about 90, he would decide whether to continue the institution of the Dalai Lama. At that point, and for years after that, he was uncertain whether it should continue or perhaps be ended with him, given that China was bent upon hijacking and exploiting it to tighten its control over Tibet and its future. I found it quite remarkable that he was certain in his mind that not only would he live to be 90, but even be in a position to make that determination. 15 years later, today in McLeodganj in Himachal Pradesh in India, the Dalai Lama has put to rest all questions about the institution's future. He has announced that there will be a successor to him after his death. In reaffirming that, the 14th Dalai Lama has opted to preserve the centuries old tradition of finding his reincarnation rather than yield to the short term strategic temptation of outwitting China by naming one in his own lifetime. This ends years of uncertainty over the defining question of who after him. The language of the announcement, which comes 4 days before his 90th birthday on July 6th, is constructed to emphatically say that Beijing will have no role at all to play in the matter of choosing his successor. In his statement today, the Dalai Lama said, and I quote him, "I hereby reiterate that the Gatton Fordran Trust has sole authority to recognize the future reincarnation. No one else has any such authority to interfere in this matter." Unquote. The trust was set up by the Dalai Lama with the primary responsibility to determine his reincarnation after his death. Contrary to the long-standing popular expectation that the Dalai Lama could announce an interim successor until a reincarnation is determined after his death, he has chosen the option that sets the stage for a long-term conflict between Beijing and the institution of the Dalai Lama. It is clear now that the next Dalai Lama will be from outside China and Tibet. This flies in the face of the Chinese government's insistence that the Dalai Lama will be from China and will have to be approved by it. It is entirely possible and even likely that at some point after the current Dalai Lama passes away, there will be two rival Dalai Lamas, one chosen in accordance with the centuries-old tradition of locating a reincarnation, and the other handpicked by the communist establishment under their control. Reports from Beijing suggest that the government is already in the process of creating a narrative where their own Dalai Lama will become more acceptable. As part of that effort, officials are being sent to schools and offices to explain how the government will choose their Dalai Lama. Over the last 14 years, there has been uncertainty over the question of whether the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue after his death. At a meeting of the heads of the Tibetan spiritual traditions on 24 September 2011, he had said, and I quote him, "As far back as 1969, I made clear that concerned people should decide whether the Dalai Lama's reincarnation should continue in the future." Unquote. In his statement today, he said, and I quote again, "I also said when I'm about 90, I will consult the High Lamas of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the Tibetan public, and other concerned people who follow Tibetan Buddhism to reevaluate whether or not the institution of the Dalai Lama should continue." Unquote. What has persuaded the Dalai Lama to continue the institution beyond his lifetime is that over the last 14 years, various Tibetan Buddhist stakeholders from around the world have appealed to him that it should continue. In the statement today, the Dalai Lama said, and I quote him again, "Although I have had no public discussions on this issue, over the last 14 years, leaders of Tibet's spiritual traditions, member of the Tibetan Parliament in exile, participants in a special general body meeting, members of the Central Tibetan Administration, NGOs, Buddhists from the Himalayan region, Mongolia, Buddhist republics of the Russian Federation, and Buddhists in Asia, including mainland China, have written to me with reasons earnestly requesting that the institution of the Dalai Lama continue. In particular, I have received messages through various channels from Tibetans in Tibet making the same appeal. In accordance with all these requests, I am reaffirming that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue," unquote, he said. Although the institution of the Dalai Lama primarily concerns some 6 million Tibetans in Tibet, its future has global significance. Hundreds of millions of non Tibetan Buddhists too look up to the Dalai Lama as someone representing the more than 2,500-year-old philosophy of Gautam Buddha. China could not have realistically expected the Dalai Lama would just step aside and let it ride roughshod over what the Tibetan people regard as the most potent symbol of their traditions. It is from that standpoint that the announcement today becomes even more significant. He's reclaiming future history rather than letting China gradually erase all traces of the uniqueness of the Tibetan culture. So far, Beijing has simply waited for the Dalai Lama's death and make even deeper inroads into Tibetan life. With this announcement, it is now up against a formidable bloc, especially because the Dalai Lama has reached the decision after widespread global consultation. It is now inevitable that the 15th Dalai Lama will be from outside China and Tibet. If that turns out to be from among the Tibetan community exiled in India, it will set the stage for even greater tensions between the two countries. Reincarnations of Dalai Lamas are a highly guarded and secretive process, as part of which potential children are subjected to a rigorous series of tests to establish their knowledge of their past lives. In the case of the 15th Dalai Lama, the prospective children will be required to remember specific details of the current Dalai Lama's life, including perhaps some personal objects. Scholars who preferred a sort of placeholder successor to be named in his lifetime have pointed out the dangers of the long gap between a new reincarnation after his death growing in stature and influence, and Beijing hijacking the institution and propping up its own Dalai Lama. Perhaps the Dalai Lama's thinking has been to preserve the sanctity of the mystical process of finding a reincarnation the way he was found when he was 2 years old. His announcement today reclaims that history and poses a great challenge to China when it embarks on its own process of declaring the next Dalai Lama. The challenge for Beijing will be to persuade the Tibetan people, even while tightening control over the future of Tibet and its ancient traditions. Thank you for watching.